Hello everybody and welcome to this, my second of two videos on the Canon EOS Digital Rebel XT, also called the 350D or Kiss Digital N. In the first video we looked at what all of the stuff on the camera is. In this video we're going to talk about how to use all of it to take photos. First thing is that this camera cannot do anything without a battery, being digital, so we're going to look at how to change the battery. If you have a battery grip, you take the battery door off this way. There's a little release there, and then you can attach a battery grip. They are useful. They allow you to put a second battery in here, which does extend the life of this camera significantly. To remove the battery, there's a little orange clip there. You just push it off to the side, and now you can pull the battery, which is a Canon NB2L, or NB2L, yes. And I don't know if Canon still makes these or not, but the third-party ones are just fine. And then the clock battery, is we saw in the first video, is this little CR2016 right here that pops out and pops back in. This is rechargeable, and so once the battery dies, you put this in the recharger, grab one that's fresh, and then just slide it in like that, and you have changed the battery. Next thing we're going to do is talk about how to change the CF card. Access it by sliding this door out and up. This uses CF type 2 cards up to 8 gigabytes. This is 520 megs. Just going to slide it in right there. And now we can close the door. And as you can see, 512 photos is 512 megs rather, is 57, I assume, raw photos. We'll see for sure. But it looks like it's going to take 57 images on a 512 meg CF card. So if we multiply that by 16, looks like it's around 400 for an 8 gig CF card. To take the CF card out and put a new one in, you simply open that door, push down on the button to the side of it, and now you can pull out the CF card and pop a new one in. Next, let's take a look at the mode dial, which is this right up here on the top, and we're going to go through everything. We're going to start up here, up here at ADEP. We're going to talk about what all of these different modes are. ADEP is automatic exposure depth of field priority. Now what that means is that your camera will pick the aperture that will give you a depth of field which is ideal for getting all of your subjects in focus. So let's say you're standing over here with your camera and you've got a row of people at a wedding. You're at this is the groom's table, or the bridal party table, right? And so you want to get all of them in focus. If you have it on ADEP, the camera will select the depth of field that is best for getting this entire row of people in focus. And that's the basic thing that ADEP does. Manual focus, or manual mode leaves you in control of everything, aperture and shutter speed. So in manual, what you want to do is use the command dial here. Oops. In manual, the command dial is going to adjust your shutter speed, as you can see over here. Then to adjust your aperture, you hold the asterisk. No, not the asterisk. You hold the AV button. That's it. And that will allow you to adjust the aperture. So in manual, you are responsible for picking the best shutter speed and aperture, and then using the light meter underneath it to obtain the best exposure on this camera. Let's see if I can get a proper exposure here. There we go. So you can see now I have a proper exposure because we're close to it, going back and forth, because that little line right now, there it is pretty darn close to properly exposed. But to get a proper exposure, you want to take that little line that is underneath that scale and adjust your settings until it is in the middle of your scale. There we go, just like that. And then when you take a picture, you've used manual exposure to adjust your settings to get a proper exposure. AV stands for aperture value or aperture priority, and in this you use the command dial to set your aperture, and your camera will pick the best shutter speed for you. This is the mode that I do the majority of my shooting in. It's a really easy way to do it, really good at giving you control over the creative result of your image, and so AV is a good way to learn to use your camera and to take good and well-exposed photos. TV is the opposite. The command dial controls your shutter speed and the camera will pick the best aperture for you. Program mode, the camera controls everything, but you can also program shift to have some control over your aperture and shutter speed. So with program mode, you can see that the camera is picking the best aperture and shutter speed. If I hit the AV button, there we go. Actually, it's going to let me just program shift using just the command wheel. Using the AV button, I can intentionally over or underexpose, and then using the command wheel, I can adjust the shutter speed to get a different aperture, basically. So in program mode, you have some control over what the camera is going to do, either by adjusting the shutter speed or using the aperture value button to adjust your exposure over or under. Green box is full auto. The camera controls everything. You have no input into it whatsoever. Also called the magical green box because you have no idea what's happening, but magically the images are awesome. Here we have portrait modes. Now for the following modes on this part of the dial, manual page 46 and a few pages after that contain detailed info on how each of these works and what settings they control and override. I'm just going to give you a basic primer on what each of these modes are. Portrait mode works best with a faster lens like the 51.8 or with your kit zoom lens zoomed out to around 55 millimeters. And it gives you a shallow depth of field with the background being blurry. You can set your images up to be the most successful by having about 9 to 20 feet minimum between your subject and the background to get the most blur while having your subject in focus. Landscape mode works best with a wide angle lens like a 28 millimeter or wider, or the wide angle of your kit zoom lens at 18 millimeters. And it will give you the shallowest, the deepest depth of field with the smallest aperture, so that something close to your camera and infinity focus will be in focus. It also disables the flash. Macro mode or close-up mode is good when you are using a macro lens or you are focusing at your lens's closest focus point. And basically what it does is it adjusts camera settings so that your close-up shots look the best. Sports or action mode is going to give you a large aperture rather, for a fast shutter speed with the aim of freezing motion. Night scene mode or night portrait mode is in this one will give you a long shutter speed and will also fire the flash. What this is good for is if you have a person, say, sitting on a bridge, don't let them fall in, maybe standing on the bridge with the railing behind them safely. With a city scene in the background, you can use this. It will trigger the flash to get your subject exposed and then leave the shutter open for another couple of seconds to get the background to be illuminated as well so that you can see your subject and the city. And then this is no flash, which disables the flash entirely. So that's this one right here, no flash, is really good if you're at a play or in a museum, or even at a sporting event sitting in the nosebleed section where the flash isn't going to do you any good anyway. So next thing we're going to do is talk about how to use the flash with this camera. And there is one way to connect the flash, the hot shoe right here. So the flash sync speed on this camera is 1/200th of a second, and what that means is that when you take a picture, the curtain opens, and when it finishes its travel, the flash is triggered. The entire sensor is exposed to light for slightly less than 1/200th of a second, and then the second curtain closes. If you were to go into manual mode and set this for a 5-second exposure, the curtain would open. When it finishes its travel, the flash would fire. The entire sensor would be exposed to light for slightly less than 5 seconds, and then the second curtain would close. So your shutter time is not controlled by how fast the curtains move, but by the gaps between them. So if you have a 1/4000th of a second shutter speed, the first curtain's going to open, and then the second curtain's going to come in behind it, very close behind it, just a sliver, and just going to be a little sliver behind it, and then the space between the curtains, well, over here, when it finishes its travel, will be illuminated, and then everything else will be blocked by the second curtain. I believe that this camera can do high-speed sync with some of the Canon speedlight flashes, but I am not an expert in that, and I don't have any speedlights to try it with. So if you are looking at this camera and you want to do high-speed sync, you'll need to research a little bit more about which flashes that Canon can't work with. If you are here because you are buying this camera because they are inexpensive, and they are, today in 2020, these are very inexpensive cameras. They are great first cameras to use because they will teach you the basics and do so for cheap. If you're thinking about getting an old 60s, 70s, or 80s Vivitar, Sunpack, or similar third-party flash to use in these because they're cheap, don't. The old flashes that were used during the film era had very, very powerful capacitors in them, and a back charge from one of those flashes into this camera would fry it. It would absolutely short it out. So if you're going to use a flash with this camera, it's better just to buy a brand new, inexpensive one. If you're looking to save some money, buy a brand new third-party flash, or one that's within about 10 years old, because that will have the power levels in place that allow the flash to work, but that will also not destroy your camera if you're using it, and it back charges. If you have old flashes and you're going to insist on using them, make sure that you have a radio frequency trigger between the hot shoe and those old flashes. You do not want to have a cabled connection between an old flash and your camera, just to prevent your camera from being ruined by that old flash. So let's take a look at some of the functions here on the back, and we'll talk about what these are. So your ISO button allows you to change your ISO, your sensitivity, and you can change it between 100 up to 1600. Matter of personal preference and setting, I would not push this past 400, just due to the camera's age. Honestly, the native ISO should be 200. Even pushing it to 400, you're going to start to see a lot of noise. So try to keep this in the 100 to 200 range. Over here is your metering mode button, and your metering modes are, but they are evaluative, center weighted, and partial spot. So that should be, let's see. That should be evaluative. That should be partial spot, and that should be center weighted if the symbols are the same as they are on other Canons. So evaluative basically breaks the scene into a bunch of different areas, and then using the scene, those areas, and then what's in focus, the camera will determine the best exposure. Partial spot would be an area in the 9% of the frame in the center of the frame is 100% of the metering data. Everything outside of that 9% doesn't contribute to it at all, to the metering data at all. And center weighted, what's in the center of the frame is the majority of the metering data, and then what's around it contributes a little bit. So spot is really good if you want to get a precise meter reading on a subject. What you can do is you set it to spot metering mode, or partial spot metering mode. You take your meter reading, you either set your settings in with your manual settings, or you use your settings memory in your automatic modes, recompose and take your picture. So let's say you want to have a person's face over here in the frame. You line up that person's face in the middle of the frame, take your meter reading, recompose, and you will still expose for that person's face here, even though the rest of the frame will be something else. That's really useful if you have a person over here and a very bright or a very dark scene behind them. White balance, these are your different white balance settings, and they are auto, daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, fluorescent, flash, and custom. So auto, basically the camera is going to look at the scene and figure out what the best white balance setting is. Daylight is good if you're shooting outside all day. Shade is good if you're outside but in a shaded area. Daylight shade is what this is. Cloudy balances the white balance for days that are overcast. Tungsten is good if you're shooting under tungsten light because it adds blue to counter the amber of the tungsten light. Fluorescent adds magenta to counter the green of the fluorescent lights. Flash, the light from a flash is blue, so this adds a little bit of amber to counter that. And then custom allows you to set your own custom white balance. There we go. Or use a custom set white balance. Autofocus allows you to pick your autofocus type. One shot, AI focus, and AI servo. One shot is pretty easy to understand. You hold down the shutter release, the camera will focus and then take a picture. This is really good for stationary objects. AI focus is that the camera will follow something moving. Once it obtains focus, it will stay there. And AI servo allows the camera to change focus as something moves. AI focus is good if you have a moving subject because the camera will track the focus of it. And AI servo will allow the camera to switch between one shot and AI focus as it sees fit based on the scene. Your AV button here allows you to control your aperture with the command wheel in manual mode. It also allows you to adjust your settings. So let's say you're in aperture value or shutter priority or program and you want to overexpose. Hold down the AV button and adjust the command wheel to the amount that you want to overexpose or underexpose. This allows you to take a series of photos for HDR if you wanted to, for instance, or to intentionally take high key or low key images. Your drive mode button allows you to switch over here. You can see it between self-timer, single shot, and continuous. Those are your three modes. Single shot is you hold the shutter button down, it will take a picture and then not do that again until you push the shutter button again. Continuous is as long as you hold the shutter button down and as long as there is buffer, the camera will take photos. And then self-timer is a self-timer so that you can push the shutter button down and get in front of the camera, or use this to eliminate shutter shake when you're using a tripod. All right, so let's take everything that we've seen with this camera and put it together into how to take a photo. It's really pretty simple. It's designed to be used for taking photos. The first thing you're going to do is pick which mode you want to shoot in. Once you know which mode you're going to shoot in, then you just need to pick metering, your metering mode, your ISO, white balance, autofocus. That stuff really should be set up ahead of time. And once you have your mode dialed in and your settings set up, all you have to do is hold down the shutter button. Your camera will focus, or if it's in autofocus, it'll focus. Well, this camera isn't going to focus, but if your camera is working properly, it will focus and then it'll take a picture. And that's it. It is really simple. Just pick your shooting mode, get some of your settings set up, and go for it. That's that. So this was the second of my 3 videos on the Canon EOS Digital Rebel XT. In the third video, we're going to go through everything in the camera's menu system here. And we're going to talk about what all of this stuff is and how to use it to customize your camera to give you the best, the ideal shooting experience for you. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.